Right, we have some folks still trickling in, but I think we'll get started. So welcome to the Rose Auditorium for the launch of Julian Rose's new book, Building Culture, 16 Architects on How Museums Are Shaping the Future of Art, Architecture and Public Space. I'm Hayley Eber, Acting Dean of the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture here at the Cooper Union. And for the record, I don't believe there's any connection between this rose and this rose, yeah? No? Good. A rose by any other name. This book features a remarkable collection of interviews with 16 of the most celebrated and innovative architects, spanning generations and geographies, who share their insights into the complex process of creating spaces for art. Tonight, curator Paola Antonelli, architect Liz Diller, and author Julian Rose will explore how curatorial and architectural approaches are adapting to the increasing complexity and diversity of museum programming, and as such, museums becoming vital public forums and alternative cultural spaces. So with that, let me briefly introduce our speakers. Julian Rose is a historian and critic of art and architecture. He was a senior editor at the Art Forum and regularly contributes to a wide range of publications, including Architecture Review, Log, and October. He's also co-founder of the award-winning practice Formless Finder and is currently close to completing his PhD at Princeton in the Department of Art and Archaeology on the origin and evolutions of museums of contemporary art. Joining the conversation is Paola Antonelli. Paola is a senior curator of art and architecture and design at the Museum of Modern Art, and MoMA's founding director of research and development. Her work brilliantly explores the intersection of design, architecture, science, and technology, making her the perfect partner for this discussion on the future of museums. From curating the groundbreaking Broken Nature at the Milan Triennale to co-founding the Vital platform, which I personally love, Design Emergency, Paola consistently demonstrates her commitment to understanding design's impact on the world today. And finally, Liz Diller, a founding partner of the interdisciplinary design firm DS+R, defies easy categorization. She's an architect, yes, but also an artist, a stage designer, a curator, and a certified genius. Beginning her career operating outside of the walls of the museum, as she puts it, exploring institutional critique through installations and curatorial projects. This experience, always informed by a critical perspective, ultimately led her and her practice to designing the walls of those institutions. From her early installations that challenged the conventions of museum design to her current work in designing some of the world's most innovative cultural institutions, Liz has constantly pushed the boundaries of our discipline and literally blurred the lines between art and architecture. So I'm incredibly excited for this conversation. Please join me in welcoming Julian, Paola, and Liz to the stage. Thank you.
I think I just said Julian.
Here, I'll be there and I have to start the slideshow.
Right.
All right, and I've been instructed we have to turn our light.
Turn them on.
Is this, yes, working? Well, Hayley, thank you so much for those very kind introductions. And also to Ben and Mauricio, the whole team at Cooper, thanks so much for all your help organizing. And most of all, of course,
Just trying.
okay, to my fellow sound technicians here, Liz and Paola, it's very generous of you to share your time with us. I'm really thrilled to be here in conversation with you tonight. So I'm very eager to dive right into our conversation, but I wanted to try and set things up by giving a little bit of background about the book. So Building Culture started during my time as an editor at Art Forum, and the initial starting point was very simple. It was that I'm very interested in connections between art and architecture, and I saw the museum as really the front line between most of the interactions of those two fields. But it quickly started to get a little more complicated. Basically, the more I studied museums, the more I became interested in what I recognized as a really expanded social role museums have been playing in, say, the last few decades especially. So it became a kind of realization that the museum isn't just the point where art meets architecture, it's also the point where I think you could say that culture meets society at large. And I became more and more interested in trying to understand all these broader forces, social, economic, political, that were also really shaping museums today. So then the next question, of course, was if I wanted to do a book about art museums, what should my point of entry into the topic be? And that's when I had the realization that really gave the final form to the book, which is that the museum architect, in my opinion, has an absolutely unique perspective. And what I mean by that is that any given museum project has so many different stakeholders. There are so many perspectives, so many different pressures. And really, the architect is the one person who, over the course of the design process, will engage with almost every one of them. And that's what I mean by that is the architect is going to be in conversation with curators like Paola, artists who are maybe going to be exhibiting in a space, but they're also dealing with the board of trustees. They're also trying to navigate public opinion. And over the course of this process, which typically takes a few years at least, they have to produce a synthesis that to me feels almost like alchemy, where you're coalescing all of those inputs, which are often totally contradictory, into one coherent final design. And so that was it. It was, okay, this will be a book of conversations with architects. And that's kind of how the project was born. So much for the overview. The reason I'm particularly excited to have both of you here tonight to speak with me is you've both really had a profound impact on how I understand museums. And I was thinking about it, and I think what it boils down to is you're both constantly testing the boundaries of these institutions in ways that I think have helped me and a lot of other people see them from a new perspective. And so I just want to briefly mention two encounters with each of your work that have been particularly formative for me to try and give some specific examples of what I mean. And first, Paola, for you, I think when you acquired the @ symbol for a moment, it broke my brain, basically. What I mean by that is it was like the most brilliant work of institutional critique. I think if someone had told me, oh, this is the new piece by Andrea Fraser, I would have said, sure, totally believe you. But somehow it was also better because you were serious and there was a kind of earnestness there. And I think it was your role, and maybe we could even say your authority as a longtime MoMA curator, that allowed you to kind of force the institutional infrastructure, bureaucracy, the sort of behemoth of MoMA to confront this thing that's not even an object. It's a symbol, it's in the public domain, it's ubiquitous, it's totally free. And I think, this was over a decade ago, but I think I'm still not totally sure what it means that that symbol is in MoMA's collection, but I'm still obsessed with it. And I think, Liz, for you, I still have the clearest memory of walking into scanning the Diller video show at the Whitney and seeing Mural, which I think we have an image cycling through here, which was basically this robotic drill that was flying around this track in the gallery that had been programmed to drill holes through the white walls at regular intervals. And I love that piece in itself. It felt like a kind of cyberpunk update of installation art. I was totally fascinated. But what I really couldn't stop thinking about is I knew that it had, I think within the year or so prior, been made public that you had won the commission for the new ICA Boston building. So I was sitting there in the gallery and thinking about how you were literally destroying one set of museum walls while you're also designing another set. And I'm still fascinated by that, basically. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. But what I want to do to kick off the conversation, I have a question for both of you, which is how you see your relationship to these institutions and what you see your role as in shaping or maybe reshaping these institutions. Whoever wants to take it first.
Let's start.
I just want to say that Julian was once a student of mine.
To see it both.
I too was my client, so in a way. So and I really would like to know about the @ sign also. Like, this is a good opportunity to get to the bottom of that. What's the role? I'm really happy to be able to do this. It's a fantastic kind of commission. I was against the institution of the museum back in the institutional critique days, which was, when I was at Cooper Union. And Hans Hacke, was teaching, and it really affected me to figure out what was an alternative to participate in the institution, and if one does, how do you step into the institution and still have a critical voice in it? So, over the years, when we've been invited into institutions as artists, we've always come in with a kind of critical appreciation of us as architects in the walls, past the threshold of the street and inside of an institution with its rules and its power and all of that. Then it came to the time of actually building institutions, and I had to really change my perspective because the power structures had changed, and the people that were commissioning institutional projects were actually my peers that thought the same way. So it wasn't about the man, it wasn't about destroying the institution, it was about building the institution in a new way. And so I see is still my role as both critic and a kind of generative thinker and designer, to imagine new ways, to carry the tradition, but also rethink the conventions of the museum.
It's very convincing. Paola.
By testing, you said the boundaries of this and the patience of the museum or the institution does not come from institutional critique. I was not taught that. I grew up in Italy, and museums were lovely companions to life. They were public, sometimes they were free. They didn't represent the power of the moneyed people, so it was a different relationship. But I always had a problem with authority. So that kind of functions as an institutional critique of sorts. And then also, so that's one component, the problem with authority, and the other is design. So I studied architecture. And when I came to MoMA, Terry Riley, who hired me, asked me, can you deal with design instead of architecture? I said, sure, because to me, they were always the same thing. I discovered that here in New York, they're not the same thing, or at least they were not at that time, but no problem. Design was lovely, and I embraced it with all my heart, and also it really responded to my need to speak to as wide an audience as possible. And what I love about design is the fact that it is for everybody. I mean, that's the definition. Sometimes it's for a few, but it's always for somebody else. It cannot even try to be solipsistic. I mean, I used to say once upon a time that designers almost take a Hippocratic oath. I woke up ever since, but still, there was these two components for everybody, and the difficult relationship with authority. So objects like the ad sign respond beautifully to these two components. On the one hand, the fact that it's in the public domain really speaks to an object that is universal, available to everybody, not burdened by any copyrights. A wonderful example of design because it exists since the Middle Ages. The monks that were copying manuscript were using it to kind of save energy when they were doing the preposition in Latin that means in connection with, in direction of. So same exact meaning that it has today. It survived in the centuries. It was in the typewriters in the 19th century. Then it was on the teletype keyboard that Ray Tomlinson, who was this engineer in 1971 that had been tasked by DARPA and the government of the United States to invent email, he looked at it. It was on the keyboard, and he was looking for a way to collapse all of these lines of code that connected the name of the person to the position of the server or the position within the computer. So it was exactly that. And he found this key, researched the key, saw that it was exactly what he wanted, chose it, and wrote the first email about that. Now, all this I discovered just like gradually, and you can imagine the glee, the happiness as I was finding more about this ad sign. It was just the idea of design that I had been dreaming of, and it was in the public domain. So then that made me question the role of a curator, right? Is it our job to take things from the world and put them in a museum and take them out of circulation? Well, I'm lucky enough as to be a curator of design. So almost by definition, there are other copies, or in many cases, there are other copies of what I collect. So if something is available to everybody, should I not collect it because it cannot be taken away? What is my job? I think that my job is to present as exemplary and arbitrary as possible a collection of objects so that people are stimulated into making their own collections and having their own ideas. So the exile was, from all viewpoints, a way to really expand the idea of design, the idea of a collection, the idea of a curator. And it keeps on giving. It's the gift that keeps on giving, because I keep thinking about it. Then, you would have writers calling the department to get a picture of an object in the collection, and we would tell them, yeah, it's on your keyboard, just like, what do you mean? And I said, well, you can use the American typewriter typeface because that's the closest to the teletype, but just, it's yours, and sometimes, you can go and wax poetic and say that what's on the wall is the shadow of a butterfly, but really, I love objects like this. And it's the only one that is truly like this, because also other objects that are covered by very vague copyrights, like the on-off sign, they're not as completely in the world as the ad sign.
Let me just do a follow-up here, because I can totally understand why you would be fascinated with a symbol and why you would do a show of a symbol and all of that. And you could convince the museum that this is a worthy show. But I just cannot fathom how you convince the museum to acquire this unfathomable thing into a collection. This is the part that I think, because we don't sort of understand.
Elise was there. It was not difficult. Nobody, it's very funny. The general counsel of MoMA was this coolest woman, Nancy Adelson, told me, Paola, legally, this is absolutely not challenging. Intellectually, perhaps, but, it was not difficult.
Well, maybe legally, but how do you convince the board, for example, to take this thing that's immaterial, entirely immaterial?
I didn't need to get to the board. Luckily, I only have my committee of architecture and design. No, but seriously, I've had more trouble with the video games, for instance. The outside, nobody really challenged it outside of the Department of Architecture and Design before it even went to the committee. So, yeah.
For me, the follow-up, I was fascinated by your remark that you hope that sign could be a kind of catalyst for other people making their own collections, because to me, what that implicitly does is it reframes collection as a kind of engagement with the world that's not really hoarding precious objects anymore.
Wait, design, yes.
Right. No, but I think that's interesting. And it, for me, it brings up the next topic that I was kind of dying to talk to you both about, which is the MoMA rehang, because Liz and I, in the book, we talked a little bit about, and sort of just to be clear, so this was a pretty monumental part of the renovation, the expansion that Liz did, was that MoMA, which had basically invented modern art somewhere. Yeah, perfect, incredible timing, actually. So this is the kind of now infamous cover of a 1936 show there that really diagrams this family tree of modern art. And MoMA had kind of invented the canon and was now shifting away from medium-specific galleries and movement-specific galleries. So there's no cubist gallery, and for that matter, there's not even a painting gallery, really, technically, anymore. And I had talked to you, Liz, about how, as an architectural problem, that created a need for a kind of new kind of looking, kind of more comparative, maybe not so much about sort of, your encounter with the holistic masterpiece. But I'd love to hear more from both of you about, what your perspective is. Liz, in terms of kind of like how that hit you as an architectural problem, as you started to have these conversations and realize this was where the institution wanted to go, what that made you think sort of your job was going to be. And then Paola, as someone who's then been working in the space, I'm so curious what it means. Is it collaborative? Is it challenging? You're now putting your design kind of in the wild. And I think that's exciting. I kind of think it's dangerous for art, maybe in interesting ways, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Let's start there.
Okay, well, I'll start. When we came on to the MoMA project, It wasn't exactly certain what the project would be. There's an expansion onto, western side. It had more about, it was more about showing more of the collection. And we all know that there's just like a small percentage of collection that's always on show. And the rest of it is in storage. So MoMA has a fantastic collection of which only very little bit is shown. And it's hard to rehang it, and it's expensive and so forth. So the idea was to just have more space. And as we spoke with MoMA, and it took a year of thinking and discussion and test fitting ideas and so forth into figuring out what to use that space for. Was it for collections? Was it for new work? And one thing that was that as we came on, there had been conversations internally at MoMA that wanted to really change things up. It wasn't as much part of my consciousness when we started. But the curators, it was a new set of curators, and they were questioning the hard divisions of the disciplines between the disciplines. And MoMA, when you think back when MoMA was founded, and having a department of film was an absolutely unique thing. Having a department of architecture and design was like an entirely new thing. Where else? I mean, even now. So, and the departments, had been pretty much divided, and their spaces had been divided. So the curators were beginning to think, well, there were different stories to tell. Maybe we look back at the 20th century in a different way, geographically, in terms of, just who got shows and who didn't get shows, what's in the collection, what's not in the collection, but also, how the rigid divisions, basically prevented other ways of thinking about telling stories about the 20th century, and also forward. So this notion of breaking down these silos started to be very much on the forefront. And then if we did that, that would be that, that this, discipline-specific galleries, that is galleries that had certain kinds of features, low galleries, tall galleries, were somehow no longer the issue. It was more, how could we have enough flexibility to do lots of different things in the new galleries? So that was part of it. We were very attuned to this because our work, and our thinking has always been interdisciplinary. So the potential of having all the curators work together collaboratively on new shows was fantastic. There's one thing that I would just highlight before handing over, that there was a concern with architecture and design that by mixing everything together, somehow architecture and design would get lost, and because in the end, there's such a primacy of sculpture and painting, that some of these other disciplines that were, didn't have the specific spaces would somehow not get the attention. And so that was
it's not a wrong concern, but yeah. No. I've been at MoMA 31 years, so I have seen 2 expansions, and plus the building in Queens, because, for 2 years we were at MoMA, which was a lot of fun, actually, as a space. So I've seen the biofeedback of the space and the collection and the behavior of the curators, and vice versa, and the influencing. I started out in a building that was accused of being like an airport. I loved it. There was an escalator in the middle of the galleries, no biggie. Then Taniguchi happened, and the institutionalization of the space was even heavier. It was like really an institution. And in the meantime, the curators were like bubbling up, wanting to break that kind of separation. So at this point, I can see very well what happened. And about 15 years ago, some of the first funds that were trying to really change the mold of MoMA started. The first was the Modern Women's Fund, where a donor put at disposal of the curators quite a bit of money to research women for the collection, for acquisitions, for exhibitions, for books. And it takes a while for these different initiatives to have effect. But, about 2-3 years ago, there was a series of great women artist show and MoMA solo shows and great books. And right now, there's a beautiful exhibition of Lily Bliss. So it really is interesting to see the effect that they have. And then there were these things called CMAPs. I can never remember acronyms, so forgive me. But these are like serious funding given to curators at MoMA to study areas and eras that we were ignorant of. So it takes, first of all, a little bit of like esame di coscienza, and you need to figure out where you're weak, and then you just dive into it. And it was about the curators of MoMA traveling to these places, curators from those places coming to us, books, symposia. That was really serious work. Like one of the groups, CMAP, just came back from Mumbai. It's the Southeast Asia and South Asia kind of group. And they told me that it was like this grueling schedule whereby they would sleep 3 hours per night and just go see everything. So it's like serious work. And even in this case, you see now what's going on, and all these curatorial groups would be completely mixed, curators from all different departments. Then there are this contemporary working group, modern group. To make a long story short, for about 15 years, MoMA curators have been working together across departments. And you can tell because even curators of architecture and design choose painting and sculpture and media works to put in their galleries. And it's really beautiful. And it's very evident in the new space that DSR has developed for us. Now, as to the problem with architecture and design maybe disappearing, curators might have all of these amazing ideas and sometimes be a little esoteric. The world still sees architecture and design in a certain way. So they still come to us and say, why don't you have any more art than design and architecture gallery? The last time was this afternoon. I was giving an interview of like, why there are no more architecture and design galleries. It's going to take a while, but there's always like a catching up sometimes that culture has to do, not because the audiences are slow, not at all, but because it's us, the institution that fed this kind of hierarchy, not to mention the art market that tries to really further this hierarchy and create some separation. But I don't know if I tried to put so much in this declaration, but it's beautiful how the space, the curator, it's an organism and a metabolism. And architects are tremendously important. And the architects of yesteryear, like Taniguchi was not very involved with people that were not in the highest tier of curatorial, and instead DSNR got their hands dirty. Yeah, with everyone.
I mean, that in a way, that's sort of the ideal answer because you're saying it's, you need the space, but you also need the institutional will and the policy and the kind of intellectual infrastructure, which makes total sense. I mean, I'd love to kind of dig into this idea of architecture and design getting lost because I completely see that in the short run, right? Because, how can, I don't know, a little, the model of the Villa Savoy, how can that compete to Starry Night or something, right? We can sort of imagine in terms of just kind of sheer fame and aura, these canonical artworks kind of out competing the collection. But in the longer run, I really have the opposite impulse. And somewhere here, there's one like very bad sort of iPhone snapshot that because it's my photo and I was in one of these mixed galleries and I had the kind of wildest experience where it was actually probably your flat bottom paper bags. And they were beautifully installed, as we'll see at some point, hopefully in this glass vitrine in ascending size. And I really thought it was a kind of relational aesthetics piece. I thought, oh, this must be, I swear, and this is also obviously my own formation, but this is the Gabriele Orozco piece. Like, I don't know it. And I go over and it's like, no, the label says 1870 flat bottom paper bag, like, New Jersey paper bag company or something. Right. And so, and I guess the reason I find this so interesting is it got me thinking, that about the relationship that the field of art has to the museum versus the field of design. And I think, to generalize a bit, the end goal of so much art that's made today is MoMA, right? That's the aspiration. Like the sort of telos of an artwork is to end up in the museum, ideally the Museum of Modern Art. And that's not true of a paper bag or a Post-it or an at symbol, right? So in the first place, it just means something totally different to take that thing and put it in the space. But it also occurs to me that there's a huge thread of modern art that's come to really lean on that institutional frame. And this is where Liz, I'm very curious because Liz is a huge Duchamp fan, as we talk about in some detail in the book. And I mean, I love that work too, but it feels like, you can trace it through surrealism and pop into, glacial aesthetics, in my opinion, a lot of contemporary art. That there's so much art that kind of relies on that separation from the real world or on that institutional frame. And when you take it away, it's not totally clear to me if the art still has that kind of power. Because as an object, it maybe can't compete. It's funny. Okay, so the initial concern is, these little drawings or models are going to get lost. But then, it depends what we're comparing them to, because I think some of this work kind of starts to fall flat. So I guess the question is for either of you, if you think that is a problem. But I guess especially for you, Liz, I'm curious, because I feel like this also gets into your project for the V&A Storehouse that I think we have one image of that's essentially an open storage concept. I'll let you explain it more, but where, it doesn't have that institutional apparatus, it doesn't have the wall text, it doesn't even really have the gallery as a kind of identifiable space. And so what does that mean for art practice, in your opinion?
That's a really complicated question. I'm not sure where to start. I do want to just say that the paper bags and the stuff that Paola does, I mean, MoMA wouldn't be the moment that we know without Paola, because she has so screwed with the conventions of collection and museum. Oh, I mean, in the best way that the design collection would be extraordinarily different if you imagine that, everything that is, relegated into this domain, but bringing things, and we're not talking about that particular piece, but bringing things that, and the V&A does this too, that are everyday objects that, somebody designed them and someone really thought about, what they are, what they mean, and they somehow became part of our culture. And Paola's show now, reflects back on some of those artifacts. So I think it's context. That's what Duchamp is about. The urinal 90-degree twist. It's context, right? So when you put it in a museum, it means something different. If you turn it upside down, it means something different. And I think that has not only the validation, but it's like always questioning the museum, right? So that it's a back and forth conversation between artists and institutional structure. The V&A, just to explain what it is the Victoria and Albert Museum in London had to move its collection storage out of the Blythe House, which is, they have this vast area. So the museum in Kensington shows, has a lot of stuff, but there's much more stuff that's distributed in different warehouses, but especially in the Blythe House. And they had to consolidate all this stuff and move it to one place. And that's where we come in. We made a storehouse in an existing facility. It's a media building that was built for the 2012 Olympics in London in Queen Elizabeth Park. It's not a particularly interesting building. We have an enormous chunk of it for the basically for the storage of the collection. But the V&A wanted to do something more. It wanted to officially make the collection available to the general public. So now when we want to see, what the collection, have to show that we're researchers or whatever, it's not so easy to see what's there. This initiative, and it's not the first one, but it's different in the way it did it from another a recent colleague. NVRDB. The way that it's done is very different. But I should just say that the V&A collects everything. It collects fashion, it collects textiles, it collects cutlery, it collects buildings, it collects art and manuscripts and theater works, and it just collects everything. It has the David Bowie collection now. It has so many archives. It has 1,000 archives of things, and so it's vast, and there's so much, and there's so many different media involved and so many different scales that we had to think of this. It's not really a museum. It's not really a warehouse. So it's available to the public, but it doesn't look like a public museum. It's pre-curated, right? So the organizational system is, by size and type, and weight. It's interesting, so like there were all different, ideas about how to, actually hold all this stuff.
Must be so much fun.
It was a lot of fun. And I learned so much, and I always love, this is the part of all of this that I love. I get to do things. I get to learn things I don't know. I saw the most incredible conversations happen between curators and conservators. So curators want to get a lot of the stuff out of the collection, and
conservators say no.
Conservators want to keep it away from the public to preserve it, and to keep it, in darkness and shelved and in perfect shape. So there was this really kind of complicated conversation of how close can the public get, how much light can it get, how long can it stay out, and. There ended up being a really nice consensus about it, but it's kind of a first. And the reason it's different from Boymans, and some of you may have seen or heard about Boymans, who also had a building now devoted to the collections of a freestanding ground-up building by NVRDB, is that there's a prophylactic between the collection and the public. So even though objects are not in vitrines, there's sort of like the space for the public, and there's the space beyond where the public can't really access. And in the V&A, it's everything's conditioned. We're in the same space as the artifacts. We breathe the same air. Very few things are glassed in or protected. Sometimes just by distance, we figured out how to do it. So that's, I don't know if that answers any of your question, but it's neither museum nor storage. It's some hybrid type of institution that I think might, be a way forward for other institutions as well.
That makes perfect sense. And it's not so much setting up to critique the museum. I mean, it's really kind of evolving maybe an alternative typology.
And actually, I just want to say one more thing about it, because it wasn't just out of necessity that this project happens, that they have to move all their stuff. But the broader notion of collections, museums collect stuff, and they keep collecting stuff. And so, the museums that are finite, only now show like a small percentage of collections. So as collections grow and museums, let's say, don't expand, then there's less and less of a percentage of what they have on display. So it's kind of like this inverted issue. So the notion of a, open storage is a way to get it, to allow the public to show more of the collection. And, to maybe not have it all curated, it's like, I love the idea it's pre-curated, because the public can sort of, you just see things without being told.
Fun.
Yeah, you're not told how to look at anything. You're not told this is more important than that. You just kind of see stuff.
No, I mean, it feels radically democratic. And I mean, it's also worth saying this is London. It's a kind of different government funding structure. So it's also free, which I think is a crucial component. But this is also kind of bringing up, I think what you're talking about on some level is just the limits of collecting as the kind of mission of an institution. And this is something I also wanted to talk to you about, Paola, because I feel like you, as far as I know, you kind of invented the R&D arm of MoMA, right? And your salons have become, a real institution, I think, for a lot of us. And that also really interests me because I'm just curious, almost getting back to my first question, like, how do you see that fitting in with your other roles there? Because it's really kind of reorienting the museum away from collection and preservation and even the past and towards basically sort of, discursive generation research and then also towards the future. I'm very interested how, I guess, start at the beginning, how that came about, and then also how you see that balancing with, curation, collection, et cetera, all the other roles.
Museums are multifunctional in a way. And it's funny because right now I'm reading this book by Robert James that is called Museums and Societal Collapse, or the subtitle Museums as Lifeboats. So, you can tell where my mind is going. But I've always felt that museums are not only places where you go and look at art on walls, but they are repositories of ideas that are then manifested by objects of various kinds. Nothing new, of course. But when I've done 2 years of economics before switching to architecture, so I can read the magazines, I understand what's going on, and I have my own ideas about economics, which are not particularly positive. And I have this problem with the fact that everybody thinks that the financial sector needs to be rescued for society to continue. And instead, the cultural sector can be thrown down the hill immediately as soon as there's some problem. So in 2008, when the financial crisis happened, I thought, okay, now nobody cannot say that the financial sector is not trying to destroy us. It's time for the cultural sector to actually show its true colors. So I asked Glenn Lowry to start this R&D department that proves that museums can be the R&D of society. And at that time, we couldn't really do it because we were all taking pay cuts not to fire anybody. So you couldn't really start a new department. So we waited for a while. But basically, it's a department that is half of me and then one person. And our output are these salons in which we pick topics that relate to the world. We did one on death. We did one on angels during the first Trump administration. We did one on dogs. The next one that we're going to do is scam for April 1st. So we did one called The Age of the Bully in October. So it's themes that relate to everyone. And every time there's like 4 or 5 speakers, and very local because we have a budget of $51,000 a year. So very local speakers, and then some videos from the outside world. Everybody speaks for 7 minutes, very different viewpoints. At least one of them is an artist, and then a Q&A. The public gets a reading list beforehand. To make a long story short, they're great. And they make me really happy. We're number 52. And with the exception of maybe 1 or 2, I've always had a great time. And when we get the videos, like for the one on angels, we had a video from Wim Wenders, like a 1-minute video responding to a question. So it really is fun. And what is the output? I'm very good at starting things, and then I don't know what to make of them. But luckily, I have good collaborators. But we're trying right now. We just found out that we have the money today, so it's great. We're trying to do a book with Christina Moschul, that is the R&D associate and actually a former pupil of Liz. So we're trying to do a book that basically is about what happens after the party. Like before, she's an expert in parties, Christina. But so there's a lead up to the party, there's the party, and then afterwards, what happens? So treating the salons as almost parties, as events in which there is something that happens, something that stays with you, a feeling of some sorts, then what happens afterwards? Because I feel it's very important to try and understand. But like this slide here is from a salon called Renaissance or Revolution that happened right after the pandemic, because everybody was talking about Renaissance. But Renaissance usually is something that happens after some tragic, force majeure event. But usually Renaissance is handed to you by those in power, by those with money. It's something that is top down. And instead, revolution is something different, at least in the best cases. So even just having that conversation is an example of what we mean. And among the speakers, there was this amazing historian. There was an expert in French revolutions of various kinds. So not only the French Revolution, but also the Haiti Revolution. Haiti was the first colony in the Caribbean to set itself free. And then there was Tania Bruguera, great artist that surprised everybody by saying, wait a second, the revolution can become a suffocating brand, because her experience with Cuba was quite interesting from that viewpoint. So it is really a rewarding conversation because it is never 101 course, it's 201, right? It's not like super expert. And we don't come to conclusions, but people are going to think of the same issue in a different way, kind of reframes the conversation. So this is one possible thing. Then my colleague, Roxana Marconch, who's the chief curator of photography, does these photography forums that are exceptional. Same kind of format. Then Leah Dickerman does that in research. So there are many, many people, many curators that are looking at public programs as one more outlet for their own creativity and their own itch to really make culture count and art count in the world, in the real world.
I agree. I do want to say, at least from my perspective, I think something that sets yours apart from all the great public programming, I think it is the diversity of voices. You really bring in people that I would not expect to ever in my life see speaking a moment. That feels part of it. And I think the time scale that you can achieve as a result is very tight. I remember the Renaissance and Revolution, it's fall 2021, and it was like, really, what is happening? And so it felt very topical. In a way, it's almost the opposite of both of your description of kind of steering the enormous oil tanker of like the moment collection and the sort of departmental infrastructure where it takes a new building and it takes funding and it takes years of conversation. So that's an interesting counterpoint. So I guess the next topic I was really interested in broaching with both of you is the idea of the alternative space, because I think a theme so far is that I think vastly for the good, these institutions, these art museums, even major one like MoMA, are becoming much more progressive, much more sort of liberal, we could say. But I know certainly for you, Liz, we talk about this in the book, but I mean, whether it's like a totally kind of off the grid space like Trisha Brown's Loft, or whether it's the kitchen or, early PS1 before the MoMA partnership, these were very important spaces to you. And so, not to sort of overly romanticize it, but I do wonder, is there something lost, when there aren't these kind of spaces that seem like they really truly exist outside of the mainstream cultural ecosystem, so to speak?
Maybe just tying these two things together, I was thinking about when Paola was describing the salon, that there aren't that many people that have undertaken, a project like that, a long-term discursive project, and in a big city where people gather and they have certain expectations, and it has become an institution. We take it for granted, that someone is actually
and I accidentally said that. Yeah,
and it's their willpower, and there are a couple of other curators that are interested in doing it. I wish more would. And it's great to that an institution will allow that to happen and not over control it and allow it to be. And I was also thinking about do we have such a thing in architecture generally? I mean, we had the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies one day, but it was also an institutional thing. It was supported by Johnson and run by Peter Eisman. And what are the others? We have the League, and we have schools. We have the School of Architecture here, but we don't really, where are the new voices? Where are the new institutions? How do you do that? How do you make one? And so, in terms of alternatives, I think we've seen alternatives inside of institutions which take the opportunity, like, in a kind of a great opportunistic way, we've got the space, and we can do something unconventional as an alternative thing in that museum. Then there's the question, how do you do it without an institution? And, when we think about the 70s, rent was cheap, loft spaces were plenty, people just did stuff. And then, it wasn't, I think that mentality of, let's say, you're doing something for more than an occasion, or doing something that's, and we saw new institutions actually rise out of that time, like Artist Space and Creative Time and the Public Art Fund, and and these sort of institutions in the art world start to become alternative, and they're not necessarily with a footprint and a home, right? So the question is, do you really need a footprint and a home? Like the World Around, which is one that I'm involved in as a trustee, doesn't have a footprint. It's going to be at MoMA. It was at the Guggenheim, and it sort of travels, to different places. And it hosts a Young Climate Prize, and it does other things. It has these symposia, but it doesn't really have a footprint. So, I think a lot of this, you can choose not to have a footprint. A space that's beyond just an office. But how do you keep something like that alive? You need money. And so you come back to the same problem of how do you produce a new institution? How do you invent a new institution? How do you keep it going? We had that limited experience with the Shed, where it wasn't entirely without an institution. The city was sort of behind the project, but we didn't have a client really. And so we imagined something new that, strangely, we never could have imagined that would get built and it would be an institution. But those kind of opportunities, even that, that the city wants to do something, there's an available site, but it doesn't really know what it wants to do, and has an open call for what can we do with this space. So I think the notion of alternative would ultimately be something that a kind of new uninstitution, a kind of uninstitution that would not cost anything, that would somehow. Because our notion for the Shed is it had to be economically balanced between box office and rentals, in the end, but in creative industry. And then it could also conceive new shows and so forth. It would have the freedom to do that by earning money. But, it doesn't really, doesn't pencil out exactly. You need more than that. So I think the alternative would be somehow, talk about decentralizing the institution, spreading it out, do the food truck version of a restaurant, somehow, do it in found spaces and not make it last long. I don't know. I think it's a really big question. Institutional, the support, philanthropic support is now, more of a concern with this administration. And, one thing that we always feel, good about being in New York is that there's a lot of philanthropy here, and, huge philanthropic culture, and where all of our institutions are very dependent on it. But what happens when there is none? What happens when there is no tax break? And what happens when institutions have to make it on their own? I don't know.
It is scary. I mean, I've discovered that institutions can die. You know what I'm saying? I never thought it, especially when I was in Europe. And instead, when I came here, I mean, the Museum of Food and Drink, small as it was, is no more. Or, we've seen it happen. It's a matter of governance. It's a matter of funding, but governance mostly, and vision. And just like any kind of relationship, museums are a lot of work. And the board, I mean, seriously, I think that the MoMA board, with all of its awards and all, is just outstanding because it is really committed. I'm seeing also what's going on right now at the Brooklyn Museum, another museum that depends so much on public money that I am fearing for it. So institutions are very fragile, much more than one thinks. Alternative spaces are not fragile so long as they're strappy and everybody's just rooting for the underdog, etc. But then when they institutionalize themselves, they need to move into a different phase of their insect life. Because I'm thinking right now there are I don't even know what alternative means, but there are these institutions that are not as burdened yet. But I'm thinking of National Sawdust. I'm thinking performance space still. Yeah, Performa, absolutely. Also, Pioneer Works, for instance, is this strange institution that seems to be able to survive because it matters so much to a whole community besides mattering to the ecosystem. So it really is, there's no recipe. Every institution really needs to think of its own survival. And programs and audience are just a part of that.
Okay. Go ahead.
Can I ask you a question?
Of course. Yeah.
It's your book.
Yeah, so fair enough. It's only fair.
This is like the extension of the book, right? The next manifestation. But you've interviewed 16 architects. Do you see patterns? Do you see similarities? Like what do you take away from those interviews?
I mean, that's an excellent question. Off the top of my head, I would say one specific thing about how architects relate to art was really interesting to me, and it was kind of a happy realization was that the borrowing was a lot less literal than I expected, and I'm certainly putting you in this category. I mean, we were talking in arguing about performance, film, video, early video work. But I'm even thinking of someone like Peter Zumthor, who, I thought, okay, he's going to want to talk about Donald Judd and minimalism. And not at all. He wanted to talk about Walter Di Maria, and he said the single most sort of profound experience he had was with buried Earth kilometer, vertical Earth kilometer, which, if people don't know this, it's a brass rod a kilometer deep. It's in Kassel, so it looks like a penny, basically. Like it's this totally invisible work, and it's totally conceptual and has really nothing to do with architecture per se. But so that was, Walter Hood is another good example. I mean, he, who actually I know thanks to Paola, you introduced us many years ago. But he's a landscape architect primarily, who does a ton of museums. But so I thought, there's this long history of landscape and painting, the picturesque. Even Karl Marx was obsessed with modernist painting. Not at all. He's really interested in music. And his first book was actually about the idea of improvisation, borrowed from music and applied to landscape design. So I would say that, in a way, that was kind of the most exciting part. I thought, after time at Art Forum and all this research, I thought I had a kind of a handle on art and architecture. And I was really kind of consistently surprised by what everyone was indeed, thank goodness, interested in art. So we had a lot to talk about, but it wasn't usually what I expected. So, I have many more questions for you, but we have been at it for about an hour. I do want to make sure there's time for the audience if we have a few minutes. Yeah. So, if no one wants to ask, you can ask me more questions here. So I've been told, we have to, sorry. Speaking of institutions, you have to really.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's for the recording more than. Oh no, we can pass it. Here we go. Okay, we're reshaping the institution right here. I don't think that.
Is it working? Yeah. Okay. So, in a time where we're living in this, as we're briefly touching upon, in a very precarious situation, climate collapse, where the political and the economic and financial systems are really eroding the conditions for our species. How is this a part of architecture, museum building, and also collecting? And is it important that museums are sort of facing this?
Actually, I think if you two don't mind, this is funny because another big takeaway from the book, but I didn't want to get off tangent, but it relates to this, is about adaptive reuse. And I think basically another big takeaway from the book is that I think artists are, you mentioned something about sort of the curve of culture, Paola, and I think artists are always kind of often sort of ahead of the institution. So there's no existing typology that really serves their needs specifically. So they have to kind of, invent something. And as a result, they're very, very good at taking over existing spaces and kind of turning them into, and I think curators too. And then I think architects have been, also sort of extremely good at this. And, I joke about this, but it's actually true. The Louvre is an adaptive reuse project, right? It's the first public art museum. It was a Roman palace. And then after the revolution, it's now the People's Museum of Art. But then, you can look at what was, happened in New York in the 70s. It was really artists working in lofts that produces Dia, that then produces a whole kind of, industrial gallery aesthetic that produces a project like Dia Beacon. And so, I'm hopeful. I know that it's almost like a kind of cliche of architecture at this moment that everything is adaptive reuse and everything is sustainable. But, I really do think that it was kind of exciting to see a typology, I guess what I'm saying, where that didn't feel like a compromise or didn't even really feel like a detour. It felt like that's kind of always been the DNA of museums, and that both the architects that are really committed to museum design, I think, are very open to that. I mean, I love Liz. I love that it's like a weird media data center that you're working on in London. Like, it's not an exciting building. It's not a historic building. It's just a building. But that for me, somehow that's part of what's important. So anyway, just to say, I think that's one contribution. But yeah,
I'm not sure I understood fully the question, but if what I thought I heard was, in light of what's happening in the world, why do museums matter, or like, why should we be talking about them today?
That was museum practice should have an active role
in fixing things, or
ecological thought, regenerative practice. This is something that's coming into the institutional models.
I mean,
Yeah, it's in the values of MoMA, and from behind the scenes to in front of the scenes. Behind the scenes, we have a whole sustainability working group in which, I basically, sometimes we don't change the color of the galleries unless strictly necessary. And we use the same walls. I mean, just like this normal kind of conservative gestures. And in front, we have, for instance, the Emilio Ambas Institute is all about that. So it's like funding about an environmental idea or approach to conservation of the environment, both the built environment and the natural environment. So yeah, there are efforts and there are signals that are given throughout without it being the only value, but it definitely is there.
Well, if you go back to Bilbao, which you talk about also, and you think about this sort of period of architecture where just giant things were being built for, to bring an economic, sort of future to a city that's, not well served or something. So it was like an economic idea and economic growth, but I think we've all sort of, outgrown that. That was actually a great model for a time because there was no consciousness of the importance of physical space, architectural identity, giving identity to a city through architecture. I mean, but it feels like those are the dinosaur days now, and we have to be thinking, much more strategically about, structures that can be rethought, and if we're going to build from scratch, how do we build from scratch? And also notions of using daylight and being open in daylight hours where you don't have to overlight things. I know curators don't like natural light, and it's
not conservative, not
okay. But it's always a kind of fight. Turn on the electric lights. Why do that? You have plentiful daylight, beautiful daylight, and which artists actually use, very often to do their work. So why not show it in that way? But there are the conservation issues. That's it. The amount of exposure, the lux level, and all of that. Those rules. But I think that there's, much more consciousness out there, just generally, and in this kind of institution, and also institutions that hog a lot of energy and use a lot of energy to keep going, to think about more sustainable ways.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you for using the term creative industries. I think that words matter, branding matters when institutions that are interested in art and design, all up and down the structure of it, those references make it easier for non-believers to see something that is a little bit more fundable, sustainable, and I appreciate you calling attention to that. My question is, has anybody in either the Obama administration, the Biden administration over the last few years contacted any one of you guys to render an opinion on how to create the guidelines for artificial intelligence? Or have any of the big tech companies reached out to you in your respective views of the world in protecting intellectual properties?
No.
Is there any?
It's a good point. It's a rhetorical point, and I think that it's true that there's no one that and it should be in the seat of government that's interested in this and getting the best thinkers in all the different disciplines to figure it out. Both, AI, but intellectual property has been an issue for a very long time, but AI is, right now in everybody's mind, and no one knows what to do. I think everyone's in the same boat. But the government has not made an effort to bring in thinking.
Not to us. I know that people like Kate Crawford, who is a scholar and an artist and has spoken up about AI and ethics, has been asked. I don't know that they would necessarily come to us. They don't probably see us as experts in this field. And that's okay. I understand. I'm sure that some other artists and legal entities have been consulted, though. The conversation about AI is huge, and we're doing a lot within the museum, thinking about it both in an operational way, so how to use AI to optimize all of our systems, and also how to support artists that want to do AI, and also how to protect artists that want to use it. So we're thinking about it internally, but we haven't been asked anything by the government.
Do you know any other groups that are out there that are trying to organize to present those guidelines that we need?
No, I know many people that are thinking about it, but I don't know about guidelines. Do you?
I'm
I don't know if it's possible.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
The European Union has a lot of guidelines. We churn out guidelines, just like every day. But I
think the people that created AI are scared of it also, and so I'm not sure who can do the guidelines. What I fear is that the government is making guidelines on aesthetics.
Oh my God, yes, that's really scary.
Executive orders about what architecture should look like, and and probably censorship rules, and that's what we're going to start to see as government get interfering, in the long way, on rights.
I guess all I would say, that's where I, keep coming back to Paola's R&D salons, but in a sense, that's when you are grateful to have sort of powerful, if not autonomous or quasi-independent institutions, because at least there can be a place where smart people can come together and kind of try and do some thinking. we can get the platform. So there's, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I guess I have a bit of a personal question for each of you. But in rethinking and reshaping and kind of reorganizing the museum and like the continuous intellectual pursuit, do you have any ritual of how you walk through an exhibit or a museum yourself? Something that kind of carries through all the time. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I can tell you, I first go through it fast from beginning to end, and with Terminator eyes, and then I try to remember the things that I wanted to stop at. So I go back, I stop at those things, and then I go back another time, and I try to stop at a few of the things that did not attract me at all. One or two, not more. So that's my way. And I like notice everything, like if the label is like, I remember the Alvin Ailey exhibition at the Whitney, I was going crazy because they had stuck the labels and so they were making all the ears. And I'm like, oh. So yeah, I just go through really like a curator.
OCD, right? I remember when I used to just wander. When I was a high school student, I would just go to MoMA and I would wander, and I don't remember doing that too often, in later in life because there's no time to do that except when I travel, and when I go to new places and new institutions, I just give myself the time to not have a prescribed route and just sort of see where things take me. And it's like the most rewarding thing, really. I mean, and memorable. But today, when I'm in my city and I go to MoMA or go to another place, I'm very focused on a show or a very particular thing. And I am actually, I decided, and I already broke the rule, but I decided like a half a year ago when I had this experience of wandering again, that I would, on every Friday for like 2 hours, I would go to the Met and I would just go to one room at the Met and just spend a couple of hours in one room. And that's it. I would just have blinders to everything else and just give myself the sort of pleasure of taking something in rather than just, walking through. But I broke the rule, after like 2 weeks, time, it's just a calendar and time issue. But I still believe that. I think that's the way to maybe do it. There's just too much to take in. Museums are, there's too much temptation and that it's really hard to focus. Very true. What about you, Julian?
This is maybe a little embarrassing because I feel like one of the implicit lessons here is that my time is not quite as in demand as either fellow or business, but I always stop at the cafe first, even if it's just like 5 minutes for an espresso. And then I always try and force myself, even if it looks really bad and cheesy, to go through the gift shop on my way out, just because I'm,
Before the
No.
exhibition.
So cafe, exhibition, shop, and that's because if this wasn't clear from my
You're our
intro.
ideal audience.
Well, no, I never, but I will say I mean I always buy something at the cafe, and it's usually very overpriced coffee. But I almost never buy anything in the shop. But I am just very interested in how these programs interact. Right, I'm interested in kind of how the art experience is framed and how how the institution combines it. And I also, this is maybe like extra personal, but I think when I was an undergrad and, kind of in my formative years starting to study art history, the mall was like sort of the boogeyman of the museum that, that was like the really common complaint. A lot of critics and historians like, oh God, more shops and restaurants, like the museum's just a place where you go and hang out. And I think I'm sort of fascinated by the fact that today, like, joke's on them because the mall is basically totally extinct and museums are doing fine. Museums are growing and proliferating. And so I'm very interested in that idea. Even if, I think I would aspire for the multi-use aspect of museum to ultimately be more than a gift shop. I'm just interested in that idea of combining programs beyond looking at art. It's as important as that is, and maybe it's central, so it should be. So how do my spiel?
I'm really interested in this idea that you brought of an alternative space, especially the analogy of like what a food truck is to a restaurant. And the idea that alternative space is kind of something more impermanent and ephemeral as compared to the spaces we have now. How do you think media, especially like I think the obsession with recording absolutely everything, is kind of contributing or working against this idea of creating an alternative space?
I would just say I mean I agree because and in a way that's actually like sort of a better distillation of what I was trying to get at with the kind of there no outside anymore, because I think what I miss, and certainly when I mean we all teach, but when I talk to students, it's like maybe this isn't quite the right term, but there's no sort of consequence-free zone. Like, I don't know if that's what you're referring to. I mean, I think sometimes you, especially studying history, I mean, there were like performances that in retrospect have become kind of legendary where there were like 8 people in a loft, and I think that, and, if something had gone terribly wrong, we just never would have heard of it. It would have been totally fine, basically. And I think there, maybe that's one thing I see, and I don't really have a good answer for you other than just I think I agree it's kind of an issue that the stakes don't feel low sort of anywhere, even on like the very sort of introductory end, like that they're somehow, that's what I meant about like all these institutions, even the kind of new ones or the experimental ones, being kind of in the same ecosystem, that somehow the stakes are high. And one form of that is everything being recorded for posterity and everything being kind of like on the record in a way. But I don't know if that's something that you two would agree with. Or...
So about ephemeral things. I mean, the only I totally believe in that, and I think it's great to just take even guerrilla kind of action on space, or semi-official or whatever, and get an audience and do something. And it could be a 1 day, it could be 24 hour, it could be 1 hour, it could be whatever. But the only thing is that the general public does not get informed, and those are the stakes. I think that there's a certain following for adventurous, independent, ephemeral things that are multidisciplinary, so forth. And this, but how do you attract? How do you teach audiences that know nothing about this, that would never come upon a space like that? And that's the challenge.
Just keep thinking about your stakes high and low. I think that the stakes were never low because I think that artists always try to do their best somehow. And I think that right now, all of this recording is almost like no recording, in the sense that, okay, you have so much, but at the same time, it doesn't really matter unless it's a crime that is committed, and then it becomes proof. So I don't feel that there's that much of a difference. When it comes into the institution, it changes. Like I was thinking, for instance, of 2 exhibitions that my former colleague Klaus Wiesenbach organized at MoMA. So the first one was actually shown here. It was the first time that the MoMA atrium finally looked dirty and looked like a mess. It was the Pipilotti wrist installation, right? But then there was this other exhibition, which was the Marina Abramovic exhibition. Very daring. It stays with me because it was really incredible to make an exhibition of a performance artist that was known for her really daring and extreme installations. And I remember, to me, an example that irritated me, but at the same time it speaks volumes, is the fact that the installation where she and her partner were naked and people had to go through them was presented at MoMA with other performers, but people had the choice to go through a normal door, right? So that kind of really bothered me. So I think that stakes high or low don't depend on recording, but rather depend once again on context. That's to me the biggest difference, the fact that there's so much more regulation right now that it has changed the stakes.
I think
so this issue of the centralization of the institution, where Marina Abramovic could have those 2 shows, right? And they're ephemeral and they go away, and we remember them. But only some people actually, experience that, right? So there's a whole range of performance art that has to be experienced, right? It's not, and so there's a centralization and there's the non-recording that makes it very important to be an urban dweller and to be at the right place at the right time. And maybe that's just the issue of performance art, and it's not necessary that work is in the museum. Marina has done work outside of all different cities, in public spaces. So there's an intention of bringing in, or allowing bigger audiences to experience it. But I do think that this sort of issue of, being a city, being a major museum, and having the sort of lack of, let's say, expanded experience and somehow, sharing that experience more broadly. I don't know how you can do it, honestly.
But I can't resist. Sorry, this is obviously a very, very good question. You kind of hit a nerve, but I mean, to maybe end on a more positive note and picking up, Paula, you really jogged my memory when you talked about the Marina Abramovic show, because I feel like that was kind of like, in my memory, the first viral MoMA show. I mean, it was just such a kind of social media ready show. But I think one thing, when I was sort of doing my research for the book and writing the introduction, I was really kind of somehow concerned, or my default was that the latest developments in media technology were really at odds with visual art. I kind of had like the Walter Benjamin, like, okay, this is like these two things, this shall kill that, or whatever. And, one thing I think is somewhat to the institution's credit, but also just the fact that almost, our art really has learned to coexist very well with things like social media. And so there's a funny way in which something can be super viral, and I don't think that undermines the popularity at all. I don't think that makes people not want to go in person. So it's not like, there are other cultural forms of cultural production, like, say, cinema being a huge one, where not that long ago that was a collective thing. You went to the movies with your friends, and that it had this kind of social component to it. I don't know if that's ever coming back. I think a lot of people would rather stay home and watch it on their phone. I mean, I also, this is a generational thing. Like, I hope they do. I'm not trying to be too cynical, but I think that's a kind of existential threat. And I think what's been interesting to me is, art, for better or for worse, I mean, it's not the kind of thing you can just scroll or stream. So even this issue of recording, I think there's a kind of fidelity problem. And I think that's part of why museums are still so popular. That to me is very exciting, that, you think about novels, you think about film. I mean, there's so many cultural forms that I feel like are kind of, endangered today. And I went into the book maybe a little bit with that kind of reflexive mentality. And I don't agree at this point, which I'm excited about, but go ahead.
I think the Marina Abramovic example is really interesting because it was like so viral. I remember she had the exhibition where she is sitting on off the table. And I feel like that's a really interesting in between in terms of like recording, because it did popularize that and it caused hundreds of people to line up outside a museum waiting to sit across from her. And I feel like the experience there was to sit there and to like look into her eyes for however long you could stand. But I don't know. When I think of that, I see the recordings. I feel like the recording almost takes away from it. Like, it's recording the moment and made it popular. But I feel like the ones who really could enjoy that, understand the moment, were the people who were sitting there and were there.
But the recording, because it was a live recording camera that you could get on in the MoMA website, was a form of conceptual art in itself. And it was myth making. I was thinking of Tino Segal instead, that cannot be taken pictures of, and cases in the MoMA collection. And it's another form of myth making. It's viral without being recordable, right? So I think that myth making is a different kind of communication, and it's possible. There are many myths in art that are created in the weirdest ways.
Well, if you think about, Tina Segal, I was thinking also about, what is it that's collected? It's like the ad symbol, what.
But there was money exchanged, and there's a contract, there's a deed.
Okay, and the contract is about the restaging.
It's about the fact that to restage, Tino has to be involved and give the instructions to the dancer. So there's no instruction recorded.
So when he's no longer with us.
I thought about it. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what is in the contract, but that's a big question. Yeah.
I feel good. If you think, I mean, I just want to say something about like dance, you just think about dance and theater, that is live and, how do you actually record it? How do you, expand the audience and so forth? It's like it's the same problem, because a lot of those are meant, to be just live. The liveness is lost. And I think that's, one of the things that I regret, losing in our society is the potential for liveness. And, of course, the sort of widespread effect of social media and other kinds of media is fantastic to, disperse ideas. But, in the end, we've lost that. And it's like a very sentimental notion of, and I was also thinking about what else have museums lost? Like, when we think about interdisciplinary work, well, what about disciplines? Coming back to having, a special space for architecture and design. How much do we lose when we sort of think democratically? It's a really horrible question to ask. I don't want to put it that way. But there's something, we have to think a lot about those things. I don't think we have answers.
Can I ask one more? Of course. Thank you. I'm kind of trying to bring together some of the things that have already been said, from starting with Liz's idea, like the institutional critique of the 70s. But at that moment, the museum was under attack from a million different places. Like economics was one of them, artists moving out, the alternative spaces, decolonization, and all these different nations demanding their things back. Like all these things that it seemed as if the museum was under attack and almost in imminent death. But now almost seems absurd. Like today, you cannot, every time there is some kind of critique, that the institution survives. So there is something about that, the museum as an institution that has floated over all and any kind of attack, and it's able to readjust itself in different ways. Which is interesting as a structure and as a strategy. I wonder, what do you feel that today are the challenging forces that are changing the museum and pushing forward?
I don't know if I'll just quickly maybe put my art historian hat on. I mean, just to lay my cards on the table, I tend to be pretty cynical about institutional critique, and I think a lot of that was very performative. And I think a real problem was that there was a slippage between the architecture and the idea of the institution. So, I mean, I love Michael Asher as much as, the next person, but I think just because you sandblast the gallery's walls, like, I don't know if you actually critiqued anything. And I think there was a kind of, to me, there was a kind of theatricality to a lot of, even Hans Hacker. I mean, Monopole is like, kind of like, I don't know, in my personal Mount Rushmore of artwork, but I think the idea is the institution was kind of happy to let that amount of critique in as almost like a kind of inoculation. I'm not sure that movement ever really threatened these institutions. It was so easily assimilated. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing in terms of contemporary critiques, I mean, this is something I've been thinking a lot about. I see the fact that museums have become a kind of locus of protest as actually kind of a maybe paradoxically positive thing, because I think, to me, that's a sign that museums are really crucial components of the public sphere today. I think this is like, maybe you're not out in the streets marching. Maybe you're actually in, the lobby of the Guggenheim unfurling a banner. I mean, I think this is, it's something, honestly, I'm still trying to understand, but I think museums have actually become much more important as public spaces. And that's, I agree, there's tension there with the institution. But I think I tend to see it, some people talk about a crisis, and I tend to see it not as a crisis, like it's almost a sign of health. Like if these institutions weren't really vital, I mean, I don't mean to pick on other cultural forms, but like people aren't necessarily like in the opera, like disrupting performances with protests, right? And I think there's something about the art museum that's a kind of very like almost like the comments today. So that would be my kind of hot take. But I'm curious what you two think in terms of this like sort of special challenging institution.
There are a lot, but just following that thread, when I guess in the first Trump administration, the notion of breaking institutions, now we see it more as an existential threat to culture. I mean, it's very much there, I think that museums have survived, and maybe will continue, and very different from performing arts institutions, because performing arts institutions don't have relics, they don't have stuff, that's the ephemeral part. Because museums, somehow there is a respect that there's a history and there's a collection, there's stuff. So, maybe that is one thing that that protects museums, and I hope that continues to be. Although we see museums, destroyed in wars, and it doesn't really matter what the buildings are. I do think there's, there are many threats like financial dissolution. Is a threat. Censorship is a threat. There are many. Think of more.
That's such an important point you just made. Of course, the collections make the difference. You're completely right. To me, the real institutional critique, and I have to say, I was not here in the 70s and 80s. I came here in the 90s. And when I was in Italy, museums were the least of the worries because we had terrorism. So it was like harder. But the real institutional critique is the one that comes in a very ignorant way, like when Giuliani threatens to take all the money away from the Brooklyn Museum because of the sensation showing the Chrysophilia Virgin Mary with the dog, or what happened, what might happen now. We'll see what happens, or the Kennedy Center that's been taken over. So this kind of critique that is not about the art, but about the institution itself and what it represents for the world and for society. To me, that's the dangerous critique. And instead, I agree with you that so much of what's been going on in museums has been quite performative and very vital for the museum. And instead, that kind of critique is deadly for museums.
I think, just one other more esoteric point maybe is the notion of the somehow the disappearance of expertise. And I say this when I think of LACMA, and I think it's not that curators are going to go anywhere, but the sort of lack of those, collections galleries, and this is a new approach to museum making, is to tell stories across geographies and across histories. But what's at stake is the deep expertise in particular, particular knowledge, and I do worry about that, but that's very internal to particular museums, especially encyclopedic museums.
I think that's a good point. I'll just say quickly. I talked to Zoltor about that project a lot in the book, and I think it's tricky because I can be kind of glib about the white cube and a certain kind of modern art is really leaning on it, but when you get to an encyclopedic museum, you have potentially many millennium of human history, and that's dealing with this too. And there, I think the institutional frame isn't like this sort of theatrical prop like maybe it is for Duchamp. It's incredibly important to bring some context, and it's interesting because I think, I guess like read the book, and I don't want to mischaracterize it, but in a way, Zumthor is like the perfect architect for that because he himself is almost a mystic, right? So he has no problem, I think, kind of. Like he's trying to build this really sort of powerful spatial material environment and then kind of set the objects loose. And I think that's kind of his fantasy of what a museum should be. And I hope he succeeds, but I think, it does. It really sort of, it really de-emphasizes the whole kind of intellectual apparatus.
This is, where an architect can't really just change an institute. I mean, it's really unusual that Michael Govan gave, Zumthor, the possibility of transforming the entire structure of the museum because of the architecture.
Right.
I don't think that came from the curatorial.
No, right. Yeah.
It comes from the leadership. It didn't come from any.
No, and I mean, I'll say, I don't want to get, I mean, this is like, it's obviously been a sort of, a very troubled project politically. And I hope for the best for both architecture and the institution. But yeah, I mean, I guess all I would say is I think what's interesting about that is if you look at Govin's commission and also his history with Zumthor, because they first worked together idea for what was supposed to be a very specific pavilion for one artist. He's sort of treated, he wanted to hire an artist, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think he wanted someone to kind of come in and do this kind of like critical accounting or an audit of the institution. I think he wanted someone, I mean, in interviews, he calls him my maestro, right? I mean, it's sort of, so I don't know. So you're getting a kind of masterpiece artwork as building. It's not quite the Bilbao model. I don't know what it is. So I don't know. I haven't seen it even in progress yet. So I don't want to, I am suspending judgment, but I think it's a complicated issue. I think it's a good point that especially we haven't really talked about it. Encyclopedic museums tonight, but I'll just say, because I think the Met doesn't have the same architectural problem, but conceptually, as they're now sort of systematically renovating, the Rockefeller galleries are in progress and they're trying to redo modern contemporary with Frida, and they're kind of confronting some of these same problems, I think, conceptually.
I have to say, here as an architect that does museums, I have a strong opinion, and it's very different. Yeah. From this Zumthor example, although his other museums, have been,
Kunsthal is perfect.
Yeah, Kunsthal.
Exactly. That's very different.
But there is and maybe because I have a tremendous respect for what artists do and what curators do, that you just don't want to tread too far. Like where's the line between making a statement and then overstating yourself. And your voice, and how loud should your voice be in the context of museum making? And, I think everyone has to answer that question. My own is that you have to find that balance of, contributing to what museums do, which is, exposing the public to new ideas and to new experiences and all of that. You balance that, and that's where the architecture comes in, with also the voice of the artists and curators, and giving them space and latitude to speak without limiting it.
Okay, we could talk about this all. I guess what I'll also say, and I don't mean to exonerate anyone at Blackwell, but I think what's also interesting that is not irrelevant to this somehow is that the Encyclopedic Museum is in itself kind of problematic idea now. So I think in a way that, and this really, like, I feel like sort of the difference between kind of productive critique and kind of anti-expertise is razor thin. So, I'm not even sure which side I come down on, but if you know what I mean, I think it's an easy moment to say like, oh, this Encyclopedic Museum wasn't working because look, and again, this is what I mean about the Met. It's like, well, wait, why were the Rockefeller collection, why were these sort of relegated to these secondary galleries? Oh, because it's all the non-Western stuff, for example, So I think there's a kind of, if that makes sense, like we're back to institutional critique in a way, but it's a little bit of a Trojan horse thing, I think, for the architecture, but I think it's a very palatable idea to come into an encyclopedic museum and say, hey, that's this old, we all know this is like the 18th century, 19th century European imperialist model of a collection. We're going to blow it up. And, that critique in itself is not totally wrong, but you see what I'm saying. It creates this weird problem.
But it does. When you see a collection together, you understand what the collection is historically.
Right.
But when you break it up, you lose that history. But, I think, maybe it's a balancing act. It's like if you go to the extreme, let's say, and you just blow it up, you lose all those connections that are actually that may be historical and geographical, and state that history. And if you blow it up, you'll never remember that history. You won't have any evidence of it. So it's somewhere. It's somewhere in the middle. I think you preserve collections, but you also give the freedom to mix them up and tell different stories.
No, I totally agree, and I just I wanted to bring that up because I don't know that 15 or 20 years ago you could have gotten away with that. But I think, I think it's sort of the politics of, how we see institutions are changing all the time. And then that opens certain architectural doors. Not that those should be doors that are walked through necessarily, but you know what I mean? I think in a way that kind of put the possibility on the table. If that makes sense. Okay.
Ben is signaling.
Something so young.
Yeah. I think we're at the end of the questions. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations on the book. Public wants to understand that.